This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Thanks for joining me once again for my continuing conversation with Robert Graham, the Executive Director of the Virgin Islands Housing Authority. Director Graham, in part one, you mentioned the two hurricanes that hit the Virgin Islands, and it damaged quite a bit of your housing stock that you've been replacing over time. Right now, we're in the early days of the hurricane season. Can you tell us about what you and your teams are doing to prepare for this season?
Well, hurricane season starts June 1st and it ends November 30th. So it's a seasonal response. Every year there is an agency called VITEMA, Virgin Islands Emergency Management, and what it does is it coordinates all agencies' preparation for hurricane season. So every 2 weeks, every month, there are standing meetings where every agency, whether it's the fire department, police department, housing authority, Department of Education, Human Services, Health Department, everyone, the head of those agencies are on a call every month about the preparation for hurricane season. And this is done every year, and it starts right after the hurricane season closes. The territory collectively work together to ensure that all the necessary equipment, all the necessary communication, all the emergency teams are established, the contact information, the radios, whatever is needed in terms of sandbags to put in locations to prevent flooding in housing and businesses.
A couple of things when we work with clients of ours and other agencies, we do emphasize the disaster recovery and planning, but whether that is hurricane, fire, or tornado, whatever the, disaster is. And we now, unfortunately, can add COVID to that disaster recovery and planning category.
Yes.
But, you just mentioned a couple of really crucial things as far as communication, coordination, knowing what to do, who does it, and when to do it. What I think of those fire drills when we were all in school, you have to have worked through to know what to do. So I'm glad you included that.
No matter what the disaster is, the playbook is the same. There has to be coordination, communication, and everyone has to do their job at that point in time that's needed.
A few days ago, it was announced that you guys had closed on the $73 million RAD conversion with those 248 affordable rental homes. I think those are in the St. Croix area that I read. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell us more about that and highlight that for us, because that's a really big deal for any agency, and especially how impactful it was for you guys.
Well, it's lessons learned from HUD, and HUD established a rental assistance demonstration program to be able to address there is a physical needs. It goes back 50 years when housing authorities built housing in the 1940s. What did not happen as the housing was built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had family developments built in the 40s and 50s, and you had senior developments being built in the 60s and 70s. And what did not happen in that process was a reserve for capital improvements. Nowhere in the world do you build new developments without a reserve for capital improvements. But in this process, the federal government did not allow for or allocate funds for capital improvements. So the federal government answered at that point in time in the 50s and in the 60s, well, they let it accumulate. The capital improvements, the deferred capital, the deferred maintenance just increased. And it did not do anything about it until, I believe, the early 70s, when it had what they called Capital Improvement Assistance Program, I think it was. And it was a CAP was the acronym. But what it did was provide a pot of money that housing authorities had to compete for in order to replace roofs or boilers in the mainland. Housing authorities had to compete for that money. It was a small pot of money. It was never enough money. And so over time, when you go from one decade to the next, you go from the 60s to the 70s, by the time you get to the 80s, that deferred capital improvement had a name for it. And so by the time you get to the 90s, that number was $50 billion. By the time you get to the 2000, that number was $60 billion. By the time you get to 2010s, that number is $70 billion of deferred capital improvement for 1.1 million public housing units.
So, speaking of the RAD and how many units are going to be available and what the conversion is going to look like, and really what you guys have done there in your region, tell us about what happened today, because I know today was big news for you guys related to that.
Yes, it is, because it demonstrates that HUD's idea of trying to salvage housing assistance for families that need it. And as you know, only 1 in 4 households in the country are able to get the housing assistance that they need. And you have over 8 million people paying more than 50% of their income in rent. And so it is necessary to have strategies that's going to provide more housing. And I have to commend the Biden administration and Secretary of HUD, Marcia Fudge, because they have really concentrated on how to improve the housing stock. And they have just implemented a number of things. HUD Secretary called it Our Way Home, how to increase the housing stock for affordable housing. And they are doing a number of things in trying to guide agencies, cities, in terms of dealing with zoning and dealing with barriers to provide affordable housing, funding. So HUD's doing everything. I think this administration is doing more than previous administrations in helping cities provide affordable housing. And so for us, this begins the process of transferring our public housing assistance from that platform to project-based voucher through the RAD program. This 248 units is the first of many developments to come. And again, we're going to produce 300 units of new housing each year for the next 10 years, and much of that is going to be RAD. So I do not expect to have much public housing left after 10 years. It will be either comprehensively rehab units or new units. And RAD is going to be the vehicle that allows the rent to be set high enough so that it can have the project can have debt service if necessary. We have 3 developer partners, national developers, and I want to mention them because they are really, really good. Penrose out of Philadelphia, MDG out of New York, the Richmond Group out of New York, and these developers are working with us, and they are implementing a comprehensive rehab, and in this particular case, that's going to change how families feel about their living environment. We're rehabbing units that folks can be proud of, that they can build their families, they can develop the next generation of leaders and movers and shakers. And we are proud of the work that we're doing with this development, but we're going to do that across the board in the territory. And one other thing I want to mention, we're not only building the buildings that folks can be proud of, but we have a program for residents that is new and is different. And here's how it's different. We're going to have a funding source for resident services in our new developments that was never used before. Low-income housing tax credit provides equity from investors. We have gotten the developers and the investors to agree to set aside in a reserve $500 per unit for 15 years. The length of time, the compliance period for low-income housing tax credits, that's the money comes from Treasury, $8 billion a year for low-income housing tax credit. That number needs to be increased by 100%. The Biden administration, I think, supports that. So for a typical 100-unit development, setting aside $500 per year for 15 years provides a budget for resident services of $50,000 per year for 15 years. That has never been done before, and it is, I told the HUD Secretary, Marcia Fudge, that this can be replicated across housing authorities across the country for resident services. What we will do is have a resident council elected by the residents. They will work with the housing authority to develop programs with a budget template for $50,000 a year. They can develop programs for that 100-unit household. And on average, that would be 250 people in that development. We will develop programs for the seniors, for the kids, for individuals to increase their ability to work, to increase their educational opportunities, and increase their health outcomes. Those will be the three targets for the budget for resident services. It's called Bright Path. We have a new staff in place to implement it. We're working with the developers and the third-party property management companies that come along with the development. From the developer is a third-party property management company. So the Housing Authority will not manage the new developments. A professional development company will manage the developments, and we have in place a budget for each new development that will move the needle for residents in terms of economics, in terms of jobs, in terms of health, in terms of career opportunities. I am so proud of this part, more than I am of the development. I am proud of this model for resident services that's going to change the paradigm for resident services.
That's a good reminder and really a call out to everybody to make sure that resident councils and resident services are included in redevelopment efforts and, and all of the asset management functions. So thank you for that. I'm glad you mentioned HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. She recently came to the U.S. Virgin Islands. How did that visit go?
That visit was a purposeful visit, because what the Secretary wanted to impart to all of us is that she wants to make sure that the money that is provided for recovery is utilized effectively, efficiently, and right away. That message was clear in every discussion that she had, is that you guys have to use this money. The only thing that Secretary Fudge may have discounted was that after the hurricanes, 2017, it took another year for the action plan to be approved by HUD. So it took 2 years to get the approval of the plans for the recovery. And so that is not taken into consideration how long it took to get the action plans approved. And then once you get the action plans approved, it takes time to plan, design, procure professional architects and engineers, and also developers or contractors to do the development. So that lag time is just dismissed up front when it takes 2 to 3 years just to get access to the money, and that wasn't available. But her point is taken, because clearly she wants to make a difference and help people, and we cannot disagree with that goal. And so we're doing everything we can to move it, which is why we have 3 developer partners. Before this, we worked with 1 developer at a time. We're saying that we are stretching ourselves to make sure that we can expand our ability to produce these units. And again, this is the most aggressive redevelopment plan in the country. I'll challenge anybody to say that they have a more aggressive redevelopment plan than what we have, 3,000 units in 10 years.
I am glad that you were able to give her that perspective and, that practitioner and development perspective, and how it really is implied, and works out in the real world, so to speak, not just in the regulations and, the funding streams, because there's such an operational piece of this. And you give really good insight onto how it works out in the real world, I guess I could say.
One other concern that she had was the high cost of construction, and she wanted us to consider modular development as a cheaper source. But we have another option that we can use, and that is the Housing Finance Agency has a program where we can repair units. In the territory, there's 50,000 units, half ownership, half rental. Every single-family home in the territory has an accessory dwelling unit. In other words, a single-family home has a separate unit with separate entrance. Those units are being underutilized. And so in the territory, if you have 50,000 units, we have a program that they can pay the landlord $50,000 to repair that unit and put that unit online for low to moderate income households. And that $50,000 to repair that unit, they have to rent to a low to moderate household for a 5-year period. That's a $50,000 grant for that landlord to put a unit online. I estimate that we can get 1,000 units done that way at $50,000 to $100,000 a unit. And that is my answer to the secretary when she says modular units. I'm saying we have inventory that's underutilized in the territory. All we have to do is tap into it and give some incentive for the landlord to participate.
Well, I'm glad she was there to hear your creative solution because that helps her when she's out, out in other places too. So, this has been very helpful. I'm glad to hear what's going on in the Virgin Islands Housing Authority. And Mr. Graham, you have been amazing here and walking us through and giving us your perspective and your history. We've covered a lot of things on this podcast, so I really appreciate your time here.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.